Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Office of Sustainability Speaker Series. I'm really excited. You guys have made this a great success for our first year. My name is Dr. Erin Argelan. I'm a professor in the Department of Geosciences and then also new director of the newly formed Office of Sustainability at IU Northwest. My co-host tonight and always, forever and ever going forward, will be Kathy Arfkin. She laughs and shakes her head. And so the idea behind the Sustainability Speaker Series was to bring people together from the community, from the campus, students, faculty, staff, and to discuss topics that are relevant to the broad subject of sustainability. So we've had a variety of speakers, and I'm really excited about our speaker tonight, who is our own, or IUN's own, Dr. Spencer Cortwright from the Department of Biology. Now, before I introduce Spencer, I am going to introduce Corey Hagelberg, who's going to tell us a little bit about another exciting upcoming event here on the calendar related to sustainability and IU Northwest's climate season. Go ahead, Corey.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Erin. Here at IUN, we're at the end of a season of climate theater. We're calling the climate season. And our last event, it's called the Resilient Midtown Tour. The climate season has been a collaboration between the Calumet Artist Residency and Theater Northwest and over a dozen community partners. So our last event coming up on April 23rd at 11 a.m. Is a tour of the Midtown Gary neighborhood called the Resilient Midtown Tour. During the Jim Crow era, the Little Calumet River was a line of segregation. Midtown, being the neighborhood on the other side of the river, was the neighborhood in the city where African Americans were forced to settle. Due to economic isolation and exclusion from traditional opportunities, residents of Midtown developed strategies for creative resiliency and self-reliance. As we develop our own strategies to create resiliency to the effects of climate change and food insecurity in our own neighborhoods and on a local level, these historic stories from this historic neighborhood hopefully can help us to inform our own strategies for climate resilience. For instance, there was a cooperative supermarket in the 1930s that had over 400 members. It was the largest Black-owned grocery store in the country. There was a 300-acre community garden where Roosevelt High School was. The largest Black-owned record label in the country, VJ Records, was founded in Midtown in the 60s. And so Midtown is a neighborhood of incredible importance with a lot of important stories to tell. And in thinking of climate resiliency, preservation of culture is also really important in creating resiliency as it affects the quality of life and allows us to connect to each other. So there's too many sites to name here, but the tour starts at Campbell Friendship House, which was a settlement house that provided important services to European immigrants and then the Black community in Midtown. And the address of Campbell Friendship House is 2100 Washington Street. So we'll be showcasing historic sites and current sites such as community gardens. And we have lots of amazing tour guides and community partners that will be talking about their work, trees, as part of the climate season. I'm picking them up tomorrow from the DNR. So come on out, get a free native tree. You can find more at Calumet Artist Residency on Facebook or IUN Performing Arts on Instagram. Kathy, are there other good places to find info?
I think those are the two best places.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Corey, would you want to just throw those, the date and the time and the location into the chat, just in case people want to grab it out of there?
I sure will. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So we are recording, everyone. So some things that can help is if you will mute yourself, we'll open for questions at the end, and turning off your camera can often help us save some bandwidth 2. So with that, I am going to introduce our speaker for tonight. So Dr. Spencer Cortwright is going to present his talk, The Gem of Chicago Wilderness, Ecology and Restoration of the a great ecological region of the U.S. Dr. Cortwright is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at IU Northwest. He is well regarded as an expert in the local ecology of Northwest Indiana, and he's been training students and engaging the public around the science of restoration throughout the region for several decades. On most days, you're going to find Spencer working in the Little Calumet Wetlands in Prairie, which is adjacent to the IUN campus. And it's a really important site within an urbanized region, but he's going to tell us about so many more. So I have a couple people more coming into our waiting room. And with that, I think, Spencer, we're ready for you to take it away.
All righty. Well, thanks very much for that introduction and invitation to come to speak to you tonight. And again, thanks to Aaron, Kathy, and Corey and their team's work in all this sustainability work that you're doing. And thanks to everyone for coming in to watch the presentation tonight. I appreciate that. And I think you'll find a lot of interesting things tonight. The title of the presentation is rather long, as you heard from Aaron's introduction, The Gem of Chicago Wilderness, Ecology and Restoration of the Greatest Ecological Region of the U.S. And then I usually put in parentheses, a great, but apparently I forgot to put it in on this slide. And you may be saying to yourself, well, that's somewhat of a phantasmagorical kind of title. I don't know if you're going to be able to convince me of that. Well, that's what our agenda is tonight, to address that. And we have 4 major goals. The first one is to quantify our ecological gem and convey how it came to be. Second would be to illustrate several examples of this ecological gem. 3 is to emphasize the restoration needs and potential of our ecological gem. And 4th, and maybe the most important, is to get folks excited about visiting nature preserves and doing restoration of our gem. There'll be a lot of material presented today, and many of you may desire to learn it all on the spot. It's going to be hard to do that, but if you get excited about visiting nature preserves and doing restoration, that's the most important thing. So how did I get to the point where I can do a presentation like this? In my ecological life, I started out of work on amphibian ecology. For example, the spotted salamander here, very handsome salamander, widely distributed in Eastern North America, but we're right on the very edge of its range here in Chicago Wilderness. Here are some egg masses that the females lay in mid-March, usually around here of every year. They hatch into little tiny hatchlings, like right here. When they're born, they're not that big, but one of their enemies is another kind of salamander, the Jefferson salamander. So if this one comes over, could have a nice dinner on that. And we study these kind of predator-prey interactions in pens in wetlands. So that was our test tube rack to learn it. And during that 27 years, however, I learned that nature preserves, just because they're green doesn't always mean they're good. I found out that lots of nature preserves are infested with plants from Eurasia or East Asia, and their ecological value has been greatly compromised. So during that quarter of a century, I started to transition to doing all plants. And then the last 12 years, it's been all plant work, although I do a few things with amphibians still. Now, what is Chicago Wilderness? It's kind of an amoeba-shaped entity from extreme southeast Wisconsin through northeast Illinois, northwest Indiana, and a tiny little bit of extreme southwest lower peninsula of Michigan. And this area is based largely on drainage. Many ecosystem studies are based on drainages, so that makes sense to do this based on drainages. Here's the Des Plaines River in Illinois, the DuPage River, the Fox River, the Kankakee River. They all join around here and exit as the Illinois River. A little bit of Chicago Wilderness up here joins the Rock River, but it's still pretty much based on the drainage pattern. Now, the dark green are existing nature preserves, and in the Chicago Wilderness area, we have 545,000 acres of protected habitat. The light green are sites that could be restored and made into nature preserves. They're either fairly good quality now, but privately owned, or like down here, they're agricultural land that floods periodically and might be better as wetlands. But we could add a lot more land to that. The light tan and the darker tan are either intense agriculture that should stay as agriculture, or urbanized suburban malls, interstate highways, whatever, and those can't be saved. If you want to learn more about Chicago Wilderness, go to chicagowilderness.org and you can learn about this area a bit more and all the entities that work toward preservation. And there's always something exciting happening in Chicago Wilderness. If you look down here at Kankakee Sands, right in this area, it's about 8,000 acres. There's 10,000 more acres here and a few hundred around there. I think there's 23,000 acres right in that area. But if we look at Kankakee Sands this winter, short-eared owls just love the prairie restoration there. And you can go in the wintertime and around sunset, if you see an owl hovering like a helicopter over the field, that's a short-eared owl looking for dinner. They have red rough-legged hawks there. And a year ago this month, they had white-faced ibis there. And I never heard of white-faced ibis before. And it turns out they like the wetlands of the Western Plains. But a few of them, I guess, got in a little wayward into Kankakee Sands and thought it was a pretty groovy place to be. So they're living there. So that's just one nature preserve. This could be repeated for hundreds of nature preserves. So let's start with our first goal then. How does one define the ecological quality of a region? The definition is based on the number of plants, native plant species that are there, and the annual production of those plant species. Those are the most important features defining the quality, ecological quality of an area. So why those? Well, the more different kinds of plants and the more abundance of plants, then the greater number of animals that you can support, because not all animals that eat plants can eat any old plant. So the more variety you have and the more abundance, the more animals that can eat them, and then more animals that eat those animals, and so on. The whole food web plus other components of the food web like fungi and that. To learn more about how these native plants and their diversity spur the whole system, I urge everyone to get a hold of this book in the lower left, Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy. Some of you might have read it. And in there, he gives more detail on that idea of how the diversity of plants is going to give you a great system overall. And he's going to argue that, of course, some species are more valuable than others, like oaks. Oaks are incredibly valuable for wildlife, not oaks from California planted here or oaks from Europe planted here, but our native oaks here. And I might just put in a little plug. Over the last 80 years, there have been countless numbers of books on nature written, but I've put down the covers of 5 seminal works that I urge anybody to read. And Nature's Best Hope was the most recent seminal work. The ball got rolling in the late 1940s with Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. In the early 60s, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was landmark, legendary. And then more recently, E.O.'s Wilson's book, Biodiversity, and his other book, Half Earth, are great books to read to find out what the landmarks are in ecology and conservation. And as far as plant diversity goes and plant species, some of you may say, I don't know how to identify one plant or another. Well, now is a golden time because we have 2 new resources here that you can carry with you into the field. Wildflowers of Indiana Dunes National Park. I think this one is available now. And Wildflowers of the Midwest will be shortly available. I bet you these will both be available soon at the Visitor Center for Indiana Dunes National Park. So I urge you next time you're in the Chesterton area to go pick up those books, take them out in the field with you and start learning the plants. But let's quantify this then. Chicago Wilderness, it turns out, has 1,867 native plant species in it and good production because we get rain pretty much all year and we have a warm summer. Now, some people might disagree with this exact number. Mike McDonald quantifies it at this web page right here, but still it's pretty close to say that. And that's throughout the entire Chicago Wilderness area. But small nature preserves, I'm going to argue over and over tonight, have incredible plant diversity in our area. For example, Shirley Hines Land Trust Leidig Bog is fewer than 200 acres, but has over 500 plant species. Now, some of you out there might have relatives out in California, and they're always bragging about how cool their state is. And it's pretty cool, yeah, but I'll bet you they can't come up with a nature preserve of fewer than 200 acres with more than 500 species, plant species on them. I'll bet you that. So let's compare this number then to what is the best national park, since that's the signature of our national natural areas, the national park. So you can go look at how many native plant species there are in every national park. And number one is Grand Canyon National Park with 1,550 plant species and so-so production because they have a pretty dry summertime there. So we beat the best national park by quite a ways in this. And let's keep in mind that Chicago Wilderness has 545,000 acres. Grand Canyon is 1.2 million acres, so more than double the size, but we have more plant species diversity. I might also put in a plug for Doug Tallamy, who wrote this book. He's trying to get us to make a new national park called the Homegrown National Park. So just do a Google for Homegrown National Park and go explore that idea some more. But let's see how it is that we got to be the big kahuna in plant diversity and production. And as you can guess, it's all about location. We're located at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, and we get air masses coming at us from all directions. Now, this map says that we only have two basic kinds of habitat here, tall grass prairie and forest, but we really have a lot more, and you'll see that in a bit. But let's think about these air masses coming from different directions. Now we get warm, humid air masses like today and the rain that we're getting, and we notice them most in July when we have our hot, humid days and we're sweltering, but they come all year around. And so we get this southern influence. So species who find the core of their range down here in these Gulf states or even the Atlantic coast over here, they find our area good. But we also get air masses coming from the west, and as they descend from the Rocky Mountains, they warm up but don't have much moisture, so they're warm and dry. And it turns out plants whose main range is out here in Nebraska also find our area good, and including a few desert plants from the southwest find our area good. We also have air masses coming from Canada, and we notice those mostly on cold days in January, but they come any time of year. And so plants that are much more common up in the Lake Superior region also find our area acceptable. And of course, Lake Michigan moderates all these swings in the air masses. You don't have any Lake Superior plants down here in the Gulf and so on, but we have this mixing. That's one factor. A second factor is the glaciers. Here's the extent of the most recent glaciation. This is where the ice was about roughly 15 to 18,000 years ago. So we were under ice, and you've seen pictures of mountain glaciers, but here we're talking about continental glaciers that move from the north toward the south. And if we had Willis Tower here, Willis Tower in Chicago would be about 1/4 to 1/2 the size of this glacier. So when it advances, it would bowl over the Willis Tower like a bowling pin. And in fact, it would flatten all the skyscrapers in Chicago. So when the glaciers come down, they advance, they melt back, they give us a great potpourri of soil types in the Chicago area. And here's a good example of that. Here's a place where water is melting out of the glacier, and it's brought in what they call glacial outwash, which looks to be some combination of silt and gravel. But here we have a different soil right next to it. And these glaciers just gave us dozens and dozens of different soils right in our area. And that's that's another reason we have such great diversity. Now let's look at that. Here's a map showing a very coarse level of about 10 different soil types. There's really a lot more than that, but you can see it's a real hodgepodge in Chicago Wilderness. But let's look at this spot right here where my arrow is. That's where the Theodore Stone Nature Preserve is, part of Cook County Forest Preserve District. It looks like it's just one type of soil, but let's go over to the actual preserve. Now, I don't have a picture from the rolling hilly part to it, but we have a hilly kind of glacial, almost moraine-like soil, and that forms a savanna, which we'll hear more about a little bit later on. And then we have tall grass prairie in part of it. And then like the Great Wall of China, the soil changes here to this rocky dolomite bedrock. And of course, the prairie is much different in that area. So we go from savanna to tall grass prairie to dolomite prairie. And there are plants in this particular prairie that are hardly found anywhere else in the whole Midwest, but they're thriving in this spot. This preserve is fewer than 100 acres. Right outside of it, a stone's throw away, is historic Route 66 and LaGrange Road, and it has car dealerships all over the place. Cars going by, they don't even know, most of them, that this world-class nature preserve is just on the other side of this car dealership. So that's part of why we want to learn about it. All right, let's look at these plants that are found in the Gulf Coast area. They're down here in Louisiana, East Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri. Here's a savanna plant, finds our area good. Here's a grass more common in the Central Plains, finds our area good. Here's an aquatic brush that finds the coastal plain up to New Jersey good, and it's found here and hardly anywhere in between. Wild senna seems to have its core of its range in the Appalachians and Ohio, but it finds our area fine. Here's something called cow wheat, which loves the upper Great Lakes in Canada, but is hanging on down here, maybe because Lake Michigan moderates our climate. And then we have a sedge here, a wetland sedge, extremely common in the upper Great Lakes in Canada, but finds our area just fine. Jack pine trees here. It's a boreal species that loves upper Great Lakes in Canada. We have it here. And paper birch. You've all heard about paper birch trees, exceedingly common in Northeast Minnesota, all of Wisconsin, Michigan, and also found here. We could look at hundreds of these tonight and you'd see that same story over and over. But on that idea that there's a crazy quilt of different habitats in small areas. Here's northern Lake County, Indiana, northern Porter County, and northwest LaPorte County. And just look at all the different blobs of different kind of habitats. You don't even have to read them all. It's just it's a crazy quilt of habitats. And if we expand to southern Lake County, northern Newton County, northern Jasper County, Stark, you see this is an older publication, but you see that hodgepodge of habitat continues. Let's go over to southeast Wisconsin and look at Racine County. Same thing, a crazy quilt of habitats interdigitating from one to another. And that's what gives us great diversity. Kane County, Illinois, less of a crazy quilt, but still a crazy quilt. If we look at a finer scale, coarser scale one, not showing every little nuance, here we have McHenry County, Lake County, DuPage County, Kane County, DuPage County, Cook County, Will County, Kendall County. Again, it's a crazy quilt of habitats. Let's blow up McHenry County here. Just look at the oaks. So the white is prairie historically. Then we have savanna on the edge of the oak, and then in the brown oak woodland. So all over the place, there was that gradation from prairie to oak, savanna to woodland, and sometimes even forest. So you get immense diversity in small spatial scales here. Now, I mentioned someone might argue about our first quantification there of the plant diversity, that we might want a little bit more objective quantification. So if we look at this number of native plant species per 10,000 square kilometers, so this factors in all of the paved parts of Chicago in that, for example. So we see that light green to the tans are low diversity, dark greens to the blue are high diversity, and we can see we're at the darkest of the green, high diversity. Where are the greatest places on this measure? This area of Chesapeake Bay with Baltimore and Washington being right here. So they don't, that doesn't include Baltimore or Washington, DC. It's a little more rural there. The longleaf pine savanna down here, there's Hilton Head and all that, but still it's not all that dense. Here's around Tallahassee and the Panhandle. That's one of the least populated parts of Florida. East Texas, same thing. The extreme southern desert in Arizona, the Sierra Nevadas, and then this area, Los Angeles, is right about here. So this is more like Malibu and on up in there. So there are a few places that are better than us by this metric, However, most of those places have almost no urban area associated with them, but we have 9.5 million people living in the Chicago metro area here. So I would still argue the greatest, but you could substitute in a great in the title of that presentation. Now, how many nature preserves are there in Chicago Wilderness? I haven't done the count, but I think it's at least 400. Here are a whole bunch of different places that you can go to see where these nature preserves are. The county park systems in the Chicago Wilderness area are amazing. Let's go to McHenry County. They have a great web page here, and they just show you scrolling through some of their great wildlife, monarch, butterfly, caterpillar there, and so on. And let's just look at the nature preserves that are here in McHenry County. Well, first of all, there's a whole bunch of them. So that's how we know 400 is probably a good number. Beck's Woods, 300 acres. Boone Creek, 600. Brookdale, 1,600 acres. Coral Woods, 800 acres. Elizabeth Lake, 350. Few hundred here. Glacial Park, 3,400 acres. All this is in Chicago Wilderness. 400 at Hickory Grove, 253. Lake in the Hills Fen, supposed to be spectacular. 400 acres there. Another 400, 800 acres, 400, 500 acres, 2,000, and so on. It's unbelievable what they have up there. And even something like Kane County, which is a lot of it's agriculture, and you would think they can't have that much, but they have these beautiful pictures, bloodroot there, wake robin. These are just some of the plants. The iris that lives in wetlands. Prairie smoke, a really exotic looking plant. Redbud trees, we have those around here. Skunk cabbage in wetland areas. I'm not sure what these cliff communities are, but they're there. Spring beauties can grow in lawns, even one of the few native plants that can grow in lawns. Shooting stars, this orange-headed blackbird there, craziness, all kinds of great stuff. But let's just look at there's so many nature preserves you can't even count them all in here. So again, unbelievable. All these different nature preserves and where they are. Let's start in. So we've conquered the first agenda here to quantify how we're the greatest ecological area in the US and how it came to be. Now we want to get a sample of some of these, and I've already wet your whistle for that. But let's start out with a type of habitat called dune and swale. Here's an aerial photo of West Gary in the 1930s before Gary Airport was made. It goes in right here, and Klein Avenue is going to be built right in here. And we have this banding pattern. The light bands are straight parallel lines of dunes, and they sometimes have a fair number of trees. Sometimes they don't have many trees, but they're short dunes, like 5 feet tall, 10 feet tall at the most. The darkest lines are wetlands. So we have this banding pattern of wetland dune. We call that dune and swale. And we can see by the late 50s, a lot of the dune and swale was bulldozed over, but we still had some left. Here's a close-up of some of it that's been preserved. And here's an aerial view of it. So we can see it's like prairie grading into savanna to woodland and all kinds of wetlands, variable. Here's a wetland in Hammond. These are all carnivorous plants, these yellow plants. There's millions of them, it looks like. They're carnivorous plants living in those wetlands. How did dune and swale form? It tends to form in embayments in the Great Lakes. So forget the blue lines for those, take those out in your mind. And so we have a dune and a swale. We're going toward Lake Michigan, a dune and a swale, a dune. And then we had a beach, and the water level of Lake Michigan was here, and here's the sand below the water level. And if we have a period, say a decade or two, where the water levels are fairly low in Lake Michigan, now we add in the blue line. So the lake level drops for a while. That expands the base of beach, and a new dune can form, the blue one here, and a new swale or wetland behind it, and a new beach right here. This just kept happening like 140 times in Northwest Indiana to give us dune and swale. Let's look at some of the diversity of it. Now here's a swale that has a lot of different kinds of plants, and it doesn't have as much water as some others, very wide, and then it has what looks to be an oak savanna. Here's one that has a little bit less of a savanna and a very narrow swale and another view in that same area. And it turns out several orchid species just loved this area of dune and swale habitat. These lady slipper orchids, downtown Gary had tens of thousands of these before they were all bulldozed over to make US Steel and downtown Gary, but they're still found in some of the remnant dune and swale habitat. And here's a close-up view of a dune and swale habitat owned by Shirley Hines Land Trust in West Gary in the Ivanhoe neighborhood. And there's a hiking trail you can do. You can park off of Colfax here. And I took my class there one time and we walked this trail, took this berm and came back and we made a list of every plant species we could identify on it. And each of the two dunes looked like this with these ferns and oaks. We thought that the list was going to be the same on both dune ridges, but we found out that the list was about 25% difference in species. So two dunes that looked identical and right next to each other had 25% different species. Just play this out in a big way and you have the great diversity of north of Chicago wilderness. Now, as I mentioned, there was an embayment there at a higher level of Lake Michigan. So if we look, hopefully you're coming along with me here, then that embayment was roughly in this area. So the best dune and swale was in that area right there. And we still have, of course, some of those preserves. The one with the 25% difference in species is right there. This one is preserved. Gibson Woods is preserved. Sand Ridge in Illinois, and these are, but most of them have been obliterated by them. And many conservationists will tell you that dune and swale is extremely rare, and it is in our area now because we almost obliterated it, but it's actually very common in northern Lake Michigan. If we take a brief field trip up here to Sleeping Bear Dunes, we can see that there's dune and swale, the banding pattern here, hundreds of acres there. Right up here, there's more of that banding pattern. I've been to this one right here. And this one's not quite as well developed, but you can see the banding pattern and it's nice, but it's nowhere near as diverse as ours is here as far as the habitat types and the kind of plant species diversity. But there is a lot of it up there. If you go even further there, I'm skipping some. If you go up to the northern tip near the Mackinac Bridge here at Wilderness State Park, you can see hundreds, if not thousands of acres, but there's no real sunny patches. It's wet areas that are sunny, and then the dunes are all wooded, so not nearly as diverse. If you go across the Mackinac Bridge, then it really comes in on northern Lake Michigan. There might be 1,000 acres of dune and swale right there, another 1,000 acres there. And if you just go along Highway 2, you just see more and more of it. And this cool place, right in, I think I might have missed it, but I'll find it. But anyway, there's more right here. It is. Here, the highway goes through the young dunes right here, and then it goes to older and older dunes. So you can look at the change as the dunes were older. This is not pollution coming out. This is normal wetland waters. Brown water comes out of wetlands like that, and it does down here in Indiana as well. But look at this dune and swale. They're a huge tract of it. That's at least 1,000 acres, tons of it here. And there's a really last item here. There's literally tens of thousands of acres here. Somebody dug it up for my rock mining. But if you go up to Manistee, you start to see it's almost like ours in Gary here. It's a neighborhood, and across the street is dune and swale, just like we have down here. But anyway, there's a lot of it. So it's not quite as rare as some people make it out to believe, but it's very rare in our area, very beautiful. Here's some more Seidner dune and swale, Beemster boar owned by the Nature Conservancy. DuPont is still owned by DuPont Corporation, but owned by the Nature Conservancy. Industrial wasteland all around it. Well, not wasteland, but it's industrial land. But when you're in that dune and swale, it's unbelievable. There's the one in the south suburbs of Chicago. In fact, Clark and Pine Nature Preserve is one of these dune and swales here. The swale is really wide, and then it grades right up into Prairie. Here's a very rare carnivorous plant. And there, Charles C. Deem, who was the preeminent botanist in Indiana from 1900 to 1950s, in his 80s said, "I have collected in every township in the state of Indiana. I am now in my 80s. This is the finest Indiana natural area I have ever seen in my life. And this is surrounded by industry." Well, let's move on then to oak savanna. I've mentioned it. Oak savanna comes in two types. here in Chicago wilderness, black oak savanna and bur oak savanna. Black oak savanna is on sandy soils like this picture up in the upper left. The other 4, it was 2, but I added 2 more. These are bur oak savannas that are on more of a clay or a silty soil. And in the Indiana part of Chicago wilderness, we have a lot of black oak savanna, tens of thousands of acres of it, maybe even over 100,000 acres, but a lot of it is badly degraded, in which we'll talk about in a moment. But some of it is restored very well. So we have a lot of that, but most of our bur oak savanna is this. It's turned into lawns underneath it. And we don't have very much bur oak savanna. Over in Illinois, they have less black oak savanna and a lot more bur oak savanna in good habitat. But we need to go wherever we can find bur oaks and learn from them. We know that bur oaks cannot grow as a seedling in a shady forest. They have to get at least 6 hours of sunlight, so it can't be a shady forest. And the traditional wisdom has been that bur oaks that get as wide as this, which is like maybe 5 feet in diameter, are ancient trees. And sure enough, they've been analyzed in many cases, and they're 300 or 400 years old when they were born. But it turns out some bur oaks grow really fast. Here's one from central Illinois. The branches are really wide, and some of them are almost touching the ground. This is a very thick diameter. I think it's 5 feet in diameter, yet this tree is less than 150 or fewer than 150 years old. So we know this picture was taken in 1990. So we know it was probably born around 1850, and it was an open savanna at that point. But let's look here. Now this one in Merrillville is probably about that width, but doesn't have quite so many low branches. So it might have grown with competition like this other one here. So this one probably grew slower. So I'm going to say it's at least 220 years old and was maybe born around 1800, which was before European settlement was really doing anything. Here's Bur Oak Woods, owned by Shirley Hines in Hobart. And really the branches focus up. So there were several bur oaks around it, but not a forest. When this thing was born, it's wide, probably around 1800 it was born. And then this one at Gabus Arboretum has several stems. That's because it got top killed. The original stem got killed either by a fire or by logging or cutting it. Someone cut it down and these stumps grew out. So now they're competing with each other. I say that one was probably born around 1800. So we know these three bur oaks here were born around 1800 before settlement by Europeans came in our area. And that's a few years before Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton. That's how long ago it was. But we knew it was a bur oak savanna then, and we should be able to restore these things based on that knowledge. And in fact, here's Merrillville, here's Hobart, here's Gary up here. This land between along 65 is now getting owned up as a mega nature preserve. I don't know how many acres it is, gotta be over 1,000. Several different entities own it, and bur oak savanna is going to be one of the key restoration goals there. At some point, you're going to be able to park in a lot, take a hike all day long in these preserves and come back to your car. It's a wonderful opportunity, but we're going to need a huge effort, including lots of volunteers. So if we could get maybe 1% of the people of Lake County, Indiana out to volunteer, that would be great. And you might say, well, aren't you aiming kind of low, buddy, on that with the 1%? But that'd be 4,000 people. We could do a lot of work with that number of people. Now, on the theme of this gradation from prairie to savanna to woodland to forest, prairies are going to have very few trees in them. Savanna is going to be maybe 10% to 50% trees. Woodland is going to be maybe 50% trees to 80% trees, and forest will be over 80% trees. And this kind of gradation from prairie to savanna to woodland, and sometimes even forest, happened thousands of places in Chicago wilderness, and that gave us great diversity. Here's the eastern extent of the tall grass prairie. On the flank of it here, this boomerang, that was where the savanna grading to oak woodland into forest was. Here's a close-up of that prairie in pre-settlement time. And there were 3 million acres of prairie in Indiana. Now, some plants are this is a small list of plants and birds. This would take many slides to cover them all, but some are going to specialize in prairie, some are going to specialize in prairie and savanna, some in woodland. There's this gradation gives you a huge variety of plants, and then the birds track that, and we could do insects, we could do snakes and frogs, and this all these things would add up to a lot of diversity. Quick few pictures looking at some black oak savanna. Here's the Miller Woods savanna in Gary, Indiana. It's just stunningly beautiful. That's all there is to say about that. Just enjoy the pictures. Savannas do require frequent burning because they did burn historically. And here's a savanna in Marquette Park in Gary that is getting a prescribed fire from 2 or 3 years ago. And that, speaking of that gradation, now here's Prairie Border Northwest, I call it, in which is on the edge of Chicago wilderness, and it's tall grass prairie. There's a wetland back here. It's dried up because it was a dry summer, and then grading into savanna. So prairie, wetland, savanna. Here's Pembroke savanna in Kankakee County, Illinois. Same thing. Now here's one of the restoration problems with savannas, and that is that when you burn them, small oak trees especially will be top killed, as I mentioned, and set up new sprouts. And in the last 12 years, this has gone crazy. And now there's so many sprouts coming up that it doesn't look like a savanna anymore. So here's a recently burned one, but each of these brown things is a low black oak bush, and it's going to grow up to look like that. And there's some sassafras doing the same thing. So we need a huge restoration effort to get this natural process of stump sprouting down, but it's gone crazy. None of the early surveyors in the early 1800s mentioned it as a problem like this. Here you can see it. So here's at Indiana Dunes National Park. Prior to their most recent burn, there was one black oak seedling coming up. That got top killed in a burn, and now there's 3. And just multiply that throughout the area, and it goes crazy like this. Now here's one, a savanna that doesn't have so much. This is on a south-facing slope, so it faces the heat of the sun, and the oaks and other species of trees didn't get so much started there, so it's retained itself as a savanna. Here's Liverpool Nature Preserve near New Chicago in Hobart, Indiana, owned by the Indiana DNR, and Derek Nimitz takes care of it. It's a wonderful savanna. Here are a few pictures showing it, and it grades into a prairie and then into a unique wetland. I don't even show those parts to it, but it's unbelievable. And then if you go over to Illinois, to Lake County, Illinois, Middle Fork Savanna Special, here's a huge wetland grading into a prairie, over into a woodland. Here's prairie grading into a savanna, another case of a wetland grading into a prairie to a savanna to a woodland. Here's somebody doing restoration, just huge species diversity. Lake County, Illinois, Rollins savanna, Will County, Illinois, Hickory Creek Barrens, same thing. Prairie over here grading into a oak woodland. You can see some of the fire scars from a recent fire right there. Braidwood Dunes and Savanna Nature Preserve in Will County. Prairie here. I haven't even mentioned shrub prairie yet, but there's a shrub prairie, savanna, oak woodlands all over the place. An incredible gradient and mosaic of huge diversity. And they're beautiful, these savannas. Even in the autumn times, they're beautiful. And then here's an autumn view of a wet prairie to savanna and oak woodland gradation in Spears Woods in southwest suburbs of Chicago. This picture comes from Mike McDonald's book called My Journey into the Wilds of Chicago. I get nothing for all these books I'm trying to sell you, but if you got a birthday coming up pretty soon, ask for My Journey into the Wilds of Chicago by Mike McDonald, and it's the greatest coffee table book on nature photos I've ever seen, and it'll help you through the next cold winter. You know, when you can't get outside that often, you just be looking at these pictures like this one and others, and it'll be through the winter. Another big problem with savannas is the presence of Eurasian and Asian invasive non-native species, especially some Asian honeysuckles. So the top canopy level is all appropriate savanna, oak woodland, but then below that, it's all Asian and Eurasian species. You can't, and then nothing grows below that. So they're infested with it. Waterfall Glen is 2,500 acres in DuPage County. Large parts of it are infested. Now they've opened up some of it and it's beautiful, but then look at that line of non-natives that hopefully they got to that next. And one of our former students here is now working on 50 acres of clearing out at Waterfall Glen. Now we move into oak woodlands again. We're about 80% tree cover, usually white oaks in our area. And here are some beautiful ones in southwest suburbs. There's about 17,000 acres of this habitat. There, it's stunningly beautiful. Salt Creek Woods in the west suburbs, Prairie grading into woodland. I hope to visit that one this year. I haven't ever been there. Let's move on to the tall grass prairie. Keep this moving along. And here's the area where tall grass prairie was abundant. The big fields of tall grass prairie, especially from northwest Indiana to eastern Nebraska, but also north and south with a few outliers in Ohio, even down in Mississippi, Alabama, and Kentucky. But if you look at where it was in recent or where it existed, didn't get plowed under it, there's only a few places. And in Illinois and Indiana, 99.99% of it was plowed under. The only reason this area of eastern Kansas was left is that the soil was so rocky there that they couldn't plow. So they just left it as grazing land for cows. And now some of it's preserved as prairie. But here's Ginsburg Markham Prairie in the southwest suburbs. So if you're going to O'Hare to pick up that relative from California who's always bragging about California, then just after you've paid your first toll on the tri-state and you're headed to O'Hare, if you look off to your west, or hopefully not if you're driving, but if you're in the passenger seat, and you'll see this open field, and that is Ginsburg Markham Prairie, a national natural landmark, the highest level of protection in the whole country. It's that valuable a site, a national natural landmark. There's German Methodist Prairie down by Cedar Lake in Indiana. It's only like 1.5 acres. That's all we got saved. It's a gem. And Crestmore Prairie in Hobart is another one. Prairies are going to be mostly without trees, as I mentioned earlier. One of the best prairies in all of Chicago, another one of the best one is Somme Prairie in Northbrook, Illinois. And there's actually 3 preserves that abut one another. Somme Prairie Grove, which has some savanna in it, and then Somme Woods, which has an oak woodland in it. And it's these 3 are unbelievable. I took my old college friends to Daubers there last August. They've lived for decades in Northbrook. They kind of knew there was nature there, but they didn't know much about it. We went and walked, and they couldn't believe this was a stone's throw from their house, and now they plan to visit it with regularity. Wolf Road Prairie in the western suburbs, a midsummer view, a Memorial Day view, and in the Bur Oak Savannah adjacent to it, the gradation again, the wild hyacinth here in on a May or a June view. And of course, prairies need fire as well.
Hey there, TV, or more likely your
So
phone.
if you like
You're
Beethoven's
watching
Fifth
a
Symphony, you
recycled
get
commercial.
plenty of that with this video. But here's Wolf Road Prairie, where they show you their burning effort to keep all the western suburbs around here. There were some sidewalks made in it just before the Great Depression, so those make nice burn units. That the prairie's burning. The backfire here, up here in the top, is what controls the fire and keeps one unit. We'll watch them setting the head fire, grading, and that here. It's almost primeval in a sense, it is. Where they're starting a burn, there's 31st Street, and I forgot the North Wolf Road here. Thousands of cars go by a day. Do they know they have a gem of unbridled proportions here? There you can see them doing the head fire. And it really, these flame heights are about 20 feet, but the fire, when it meets up with the backfire, is just going to go out at some point. And again, it looks kind of primeval here. Rating the forest, the fire is going to go into a savanna where those hyacinths were. That's Wolf Road Prairie, West Chicago Prairie. Oh my gosh, it's about 300 or 400 acres. You don't have to even read these things. These are just variations in the soil in both type and elevation, low, wet soils, drier, higher. there's what, about 20 different habitats in a 300-acre prairie. Here's a couple of views of it. West Chicago Prairie, unbelievable. In Griffith, Indiana, we have Hoosier Prairie here and Lake County Oak Ridge Prairie here, but then the DNR has added some more, and there's some more that's restorable. So we could have a mega preserve at one point. All the land around it is dedicated to humans. So we're not taking anything away from humans, just trying to give something to nature. Now we go to forest, marching along here. This is up to 100% tree cover like this one, or where there are exceptions when I make like this one in Southwest Michigan, where a microburst 2 years ago came down and knocked down a bunch of trees, but that'll grow back as forest. And you can imagine one of the problems in the forest is the same thing that's in the savannas, and that is non-native, especially Asian honeysuckles. So the canopy is all natural here, but everything from this point and on down is ruined by these Asian honeysuckles, which aren't used by any of our wildlife, and they shade everything else out. Ambler flatwoods is another area of that conservation planning. Like there's the prairie, there's the moraine nature preserve, Ambler flatwoods. It's a flatwoods. It has a bunch of wetlands and old forests in it that is incredibly diverse. Every wetland is unique. You can just see 3 of them here, and they're botanically different, each one of these wetlands. So huge diversity in Ambler flatwoods. So trees die of old age rather than logging in Ambler flatwoods. We can see red oaks. Now red oaks are like that bur oak. They can sometimes grow real fast, sometimes grow real slow, but these at Ambler look like they were born also around 1800. This beech tree maybe even a little bit earlier. And here is the some of the conservation planning for the Ambler area. Let's go to another woodland, Messenger Woods in Will County, Illinois. This is about to happen within the next 2 weeks. Their woodland's going to look like this, and here it is just beforehand. They actually have many more flowers than this, but that's one patch heavily. Their moraine nature preserve I mentioned, about a 250-year-old beech tree. Now let's look at moraine nature preserve. There's some ancient old red oaks that probably were born around 1800 here. Ron Helmick and Tom Swinford from Indiana DNR pointing out that moraine is now over 1,000 acres. There's the conservation planning, moraine 1,000, few hundred more over here, but with restoration potential. Let's look at the Ritchie Nature Preserve. Some of these red oaks also were born around 1800. This tulip tree looks like it's as wide a diameter, but it grows much faster. It was probably born about 1890. Here's another red oak in a different place, also born around 1800. These red oaks can grow at, as I mentioned, at amazingly different rates. Here's a red oak that I transplanted at our house in 1998 as a 2-year-old. This was taken a few days ago, so it's about 25 years old now, and it's barely wider than a rake handle. Here's one I transplanted that was also about 2 years old, but 10 years later, and look at how fast it's growing. It gets more sunlight than that. So how do oaks regenerate into these woodlands and forests? And don't have time to go through all these factors, but there are natural factors. They need fire to thin out the woods a little bit so oaks can get going. They need sunlight. Drought might kill a few other trees and allow sunlight in. Native insect outbreaks might. Storms will break down trees and give light into oaks. Passenger pigeon could do this. You need to have these things happening when there's a huge production of acorns. And then mycorrhizae, type of fungus, probably needs to be present. I'll put one last book plug in here, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest by Suzanne Simard. This is maybe done 2 years ago, all about the role that these fungi do in making our forests healthy. If you read this book, you'll be in tears in part of it. I guarantee it. Native American factors near villages, they might have opened up the woods. Sometimes they would actually girdle trees to kill them and do agricultural areas, but then they'd move on to somewhere else. They hunted deer to keep them from being too abundant, and they set fires. How do we know about historical fires? We can read fire scars from oak trees. We can see this tree had over a dozen fires. But since we took over European settlement, we do logging, which is unnatural, and oftentimes the materials left behind are burned, cattle grazing. We killed all the deer at one point. Now we have too many, and we have all those non-native species. So we took a natural forest or woodland, cut it down, it grew back, but then we made it so oaks can't recruit. And the future, I mean, we've messed things up big time. All right, we got to do wetlands as our final set of habitats to cover here. And a fen, this is a lot of words. Let's do a picture. Fens are formed in areas where the glaciers left a depression, but not a lake. So if you drew across here, that would be a lake with jet skis and motorboats going on it. But in this particular one, Springfield Fen near Michigan City, it doesn't hold water as a lake, but it has groundwater coming through that pick up lots of calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate. So when the water is forced up, there's a complex set of chemical reactions, and these carbonates precipitate out as marl, MARL, which is a chalk dust-like material, and it's wet. So it's like wet chalk dust, and it's high in pH, so it's not acidic, it's not neutral, it's alkaline, and only certain plants can tolerate it. And as those plants die back, they add organic matter, so you'll have the marl mixed with organic matter, and the soil will actually grow up over time. So in the last 15,000 years, we have fens that have grown up 20 or 30 feet. Sometimes only 8 feet, but these mounds of different kinds. And when they get big, the water isn't squeezed out naturally. So some areas there's not much water, not much calcium. So you get prairie vegetation. Then you get an area with heavy calcium and calciphile plants are there. Then you get something intermediate with a bunch of grassy plants, graminoids there. So again, this gradation of one habitat to another is smashed into a small fen. And when the water gets squeezed out and doesn't have those calcium and magnesium compounds anymore, it's just a regular old marsh or wet meadow. And there's a little stream there, and there's another mound over here. So here's a picture of Springfield Fen at one point in year. This is a graminoid dominated area. Now here's a picture from the same spot. So in May, we can see golden Alexanders in bloom. The phloxes come next. And in midsummer, some of the plantains come in, just incredible plant diversity as you go. Now this fen in Southwest Michigan, you can see here's one type of vegetation, and then it becomes kind of a shrub swamp. There's the stream water running through it. Here the glacier left a pile of gravel and an oak island formed. So we go from Oak Island to all these different fen communities in short order. The calcium loving plants in some areas here, you see those gradations. Again, another oak island in it. A prairie section in this, a graminoid, and then a rush section. So you get 3 different plant communities in a 1-minute walk there. These fens can dry out at times and they catch fire. So once in a while we burn them. Here's another view of a fen with the wettest areas down here, calcium loving plants up here. All right, moving to another kind of wetland as we're running short on time is the coastal plain marshes. These dots represent plants that are indicative of a coastal plain marsh, which I'll define in a moment. So there's a lot of them in Chicago wilderness and Southwest Michigan and a few scattered elsewhere. These coastal plain marshes are found here, but they're also found along the coastal plain of the US from West Florida through the Carolinas up to New Jersey and even New England. And then we have coastal plain marshes over here in a few other places. So many plant species are found in these wetlands along the coastal plain, hardly ever found anywhere in here. And then they show up again in our coastal plain marshes. What's so special about a coastal plain marsh? Well, first of all, it's on usually sandy soil. And there can be a lot of organic matter from dead plants that's accumulates a little bit of black soil over the sandy soil, and it's a little bit acidic. But the key thing for a coastal plain marsh is that the water level varies very highly erratically compared to most wetlands. So in the beginning of the season, it might start here, it might be up here, or it might be down there. Most wetlands kind of always fill in the spring, but these can start anywhere from very little water to a medium to a high amount, almost a lake-like level. And then they go up and down quite a lot from there. So you get exposed banks of soil at times, and plants are adapted to all these variations here. So here's a coastal plain marsh in the Carolinas, starting out with half the basin filled. Another year to look like a lake. Another year will be like a wet prairie. Here's one where the wettest areas are down here, and then the rush dominated community, and then here kind of a prairie community. Sometimes this is almost like a lake. Look at the zones here, this reddish plant, a mud flat, something else will germinate there. Here's a non-native plant, but all these zones of vegetation in Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area, there's a whole bunch of them right here. Note also this unit was burned in the year they took this picture, as was this one by the Indiana DNR. Here's Southwest Michigan coastal plain marsh. Again, you can see the slope being exposed here, a little bit non-native, the Nature Conservancy took care of. And again, just look at the zones, heterogeneous plants, then kind of a rush and an open soil, another zone there. A 2-inch drop in the elevation, you go from a graminoid to ferns in there, and some plants. I'm not sure exactly what this is, but you see it in coastal plain marshes. This kind of St. John's wort in coastal plain marshes, and meadow beauty in coastal plain marshes. Here's one at that Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area last April, 1 year ago. We had a dry winter and early spring, and it had no water whatsoever. Meanwhile, this marsh at this marshy swampy area at Moraine Nature Preserve was full on water. Same rain, but this one full, this one didn't have enough rain. Here it is about 2 weeks ago. So a year later, from this picture to this one, it's half full. In another year, it'll look like a lake. Great variation in it. Well, I went through those fast, but I wanted to try to make it close to an hour, and I'm pretty close to that. But I do want to emphasize again the restoration efforts here. You can do it formally as part of a class. We have a restoration ecology class, and here's some of our classes working. It's pre-COVID, each of these. We see no masks and everybody's close together. On this particular day, it was about 38 degrees with a sideways icy cold rain, the kind of thing that goes in your ear like needles of ice. And people are all happy, if you ask me, and no one forced them to smile. There's a great, beautiful day and an in-between day. Everybody's happy doing restoration ecology. Our campus nature preserve, some students get out and work there. We burn. We have student crews doing burning here in Hobart, and this one at our campus nature preserve. Some pictures from 2019 that, where the students get practice doing this, and our students interested in restoration go out and get major positions. Like Jessica Gomez works with the Nature Conservancy. She's here mopping up after a fire. Here she's leading some crews down at the 8,000 acre Kankakee Sands Preserve, where they now have bison grazing, as you may know. Here's some of those bison and a view of their Prairie Preserve. Joel Perez has gotten a major position up here in Northwest Indiana. And here he is hand wicking some nasty Phragmites. Here's this little patch of Phragmites will turn into this, which somebody had to herbicide. He's trying to keep it at this level and not go to this level by applying herbicide to it. We have a nature preserve here by campus I've mentioned, but there's 400 of them. So you got to give kudos to everybody trying to keep this ecological gem going. But we have a lot of different little microhabitats in our preserve. Some wetland areas like these. Just the parking lot is about 2 steps from this. We have one of the common carnivorous plants in our preserve, other wetland plants. Prairie plants, again, 99.99% destroyed in Illinois and Indiana. Monarch butterflies love it. White false indigo, when it goes to seed, weevils like it, and birds learn to crack open those seeds, eat the weevils. So again, remember that idea, the food web from this diversity of native plants, a monarch butterfly caterpillar on a very narrow leaf milkweed, and then a little bit fuzzy, a type of skipper there. Sandhill cranes come by. Here's our parking lot again, right by the campus. Mama, Papa, and baby sandhill crane. They're raising a family. You can do this restoration ecology at home. Formal gardens are great, but if you have the desire to do it native, you can help with Doug Tallamy's Homegrown National Park and have some beautiful landscapes there. My old hometown in Riverside, Illinois, they took out a dam. Not they, the Army Corps of Engineers did. So the river went from a really skanky lake-like habitat down to a free-flowing river again. And they got out there as a bunch of concerned citizens and started restoring the natural vegetation there. But it's people of all walks of life enjoy doing this. Older people, younger people, middle-aged people, different races, different genders, whatever. They're all working together trying to help Chicago wilderness get better. So in a divisive era of our country, this is a unifying area of our country. And we don't have enough money to pay people to do this. We have to rely on volunteers and other interested people. I mean, we give Bryce Harper, a baseball player, $250 million to go try to entertain us. They're what, $37 million a year. If he donated 1 year's salary, we could fix all the nature preserves in Chicago wilderness. But we'd rather be entertained by him instead of entertaining ourselves at nature preserves. We'll close out with one more view of an interesting nature preserve in Chicago.
Why does every outdoor brand think I want to look like this? I know I
Love
don't.
Spring Fen in Elgin, Illinois. They have this high cane. It's a dry gravel prairie. There's another one there. And then in between we have a fen. This is in 2012, a dry year. So the fen dried out and they had it be a burn year. So they've set their backfire back here. So they're going to let the head fire go toward the backfire on the fen. I have a lot of people on this crew. I guess they're all talking about what they're going to do that night there. But anyway, the fen gets into a little bit of a wetter area here. Doesn't quite burn as well right in there, but otherwise it's burning up good. Here's a few people getting up into the next zone to burn, and they burned up Bluff Spring Fen real well. Well, thanks for enjoying that or sticking with that whirlwind tour that I tried to give. I should have mentioned at the beginning that if you have any questions or comments, either put them in the chat or you can ask them personally of me. Either way, if you have a favorite nature preserve that you've always wondered something about, whatever, feel free to ask. And once again, thanks for attending tonight's webinar.
Thank you so much, Spencer. That was lovely. What a great walkthrough. You had me at Ridge and Swale. That's my thing in geology too. So we have time for questions. You have a lot of thank yous in the chat. Do we have any questions out there that you want to ask Dr. Cortwright? I'm sure someone wants to ask, when's the next time we can come help you volunteer?
You can go with any, you can help with me, you can help with Shirley Hines Land Trust. Just go to hinestrust.org. They have volunteer days. If you want to go over to Chicago area, the forest preserves there have volunteer days. They're all over the place, these volunteer days. They just need people willing to work and ready to work.
Okay, I do see a question from Isabella in the chat. She said, around our area, can you pick one area that you think is the most degraded or destroyed that needs help?
Well, I think some of our black oak savannas in Northwest Indiana have been overrun by those stump sprouts. Insects and animals that depend on that. We need a lot of work on those stump sprouts. For example, down near DeMott, Indiana, I believe the DNR burned a few days ago at Stoutsburg Savanna. And this is a dream world Stoutsburg Savanna, with one exception. It has too many stump sprouts in it, nothing like it. And so if they burned part of it, that's going to top kill it, but more sprouts are going to come up. But if we can get people out there helping to cut those down and apply herbicide to the stumps, we can get it opened up again and get it flourishing again. So I would say the black oak savannas and some of our few bur oak savannas are the ones that need the most work in Northwest Indiana.
Okay, so Kathy asked, apparently your hike last year in that really hot day of the Calumet Wetlands and Prairie was a big hit. I know I was blown away by the hibiscus, right? That was stunning to see from the trail. So can we talk you into another event?
Oh, sure. I mean, whoever wants to do it, just organize it and I'll be there. The Miller Garden Club came last year about the same time that your group did. They enjoyed it. They called for an encore and they're coming May 21st again. They wanted to see it in the spring. So anytime, we can do that anytime.
What's the best time to do that one, actually? Would you say?
Well, you know what? Since most of the habitat in that preserve is prairie, to really define a high quality prairie, you got to have the spring component is the hardest part to get restored, and I'm working on that a lot. So sometime I'll conquer that before I die, and spring would be great. But midsummer is great, late summer is great. All times of year are great for
Okay.
those kind of ventures.
We're gonna get it on the schedule. So Nathaniel's here. Shout out to him and his new book. Nathaniel, you said maybe you mentioned this, but I missed it if you did. But why are we seeing more stump sprouts, the rubus, etc., after burns? Is it the timing of the burns?
Well, that's the big issue, and Matt Beatty of Indiana DNR wants to form a work group to try to figure this all out. But in some cases, like in sassafras and probably in some of the blackberries and that, there may have been seeds accumulating for decades and decades when no fires were allowed. Then 20, 30 years ago, we started doing burning. And with each burn, as we opened up the canopy a little bit more, then all of a sudden that seed bank exploded in diversity or in germination. And that, I think, was part of the problem. With black oak stump sprouts, that means there was a brief window when too many acorns went uneaten by insects or deer or turkeys, and they all germinated at once. For example, Tom Post was co-author on a publication where they analyzed the vegetation of teff savanna southeast of us here at IU Northwest, and they looked at 20 years worth of data from the 80s into the 2006, and there was no stump sprouting problem mentioned in that whole time. But about 4 years after that publication came out is when the stump sprouting went nuts. So I think there was a brief window when we'd opened up these savannas and the blackberries and the sassafras seeds had been laying dormant, germinated, and at the same time, too many black oak acorns didn't get eaten and they sprouted. I'm thinking it's a unlucky sequence of events. But Nathaniel, if you have any other ideas on it, chime in because we need to know.
Yeah, you can feel free to unmute if you wanted to.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of hypotheses going around right now. And I think maybe in the next, hopefully sooner than later, we can find out. But with nitrogen, late season burns, adding more nitrogen is one of the thoughts as well for stuff like the roost, the sumacs, and maybe the sassafras. But I think you're right on that. I think that these sites depends on the site, depends on the history of the site. Some sites may respond great to different timings of burns, and just shows how complicated nature is. But I was hoping you could just give me a quick, well, we figured it out. Here it is.
Well, the thing is, if you go look at it, and I'll quickly name a bunch: Conrad Savanna, Conrad Station Savanna, Stoutsburg, the West Beach Savannas. There, Woods, even though they're not directly connected. So that's why I'm hoping it's a fluke. If it was happening periodically at all these preserves, it'd be something that's going to happen forever, maybe. But it seemed to all happen around 2010. It started happening.
Interesting.
Any others?
Any other questions out there?
Feel free to catch me anytime, send an email if something pops up, you wonder about a preserve, this, that, or the other thing. I'll try not to drop the contact and give you some idea.
Yeah, and we can even add things. If you haven't seen it, we do have a calendar on our Office of Sustainability website. So Spencer, if there are things that are coming up, we can always add them to our calendar. If you want to let us know, we can certainly do that. Nathaniel, since you're here, I'm going to shamelessly ask you in front of witnesses whether you'll come to our next season's sustainability speaker series and talk about your new book.
Maybe.
It won't start up till
That's your
fall, so
no
we're
an-
giving you a warning sometime.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. That sounds good.
Okay, Mary, two things. Mary asked, how do you decide how often to burn? But before she gets off, I'd like her to tell us about the upcoming Wild Ones plant sale too. So Mary, can you, or Spencer, maybe you want to answer that question first about how do you decide how often to burn?
I'll do that first, and Mary can chime in. And that's very complicated on how often to burn. As I noted from Woodlands, you can read fire scars and get an idea of burn rates, but some of those burn rates that go back a few hundred years were when Native Americans were really abundant in the country. And they started a lot of fires. Well, but then we came in, the settlers, and outright killed Native Americans and also transmitted European diseases to them. So their population went way down. So the fires went down. And then we started doing this reckless logging and letting fires burn like crazy around 1890, Mrs. O'Leary's cow and that. And then we let all these non-natives in now. And so it's hard to say what is the actual natural fire regime, but we do know in Chicago wilderness, fire is common, was common, and should be fairly common in our area. But exactly how often you burn is kind of as much an art as a science. We do know that if you burn a prairie too often, it goes heavily toward the tall grasses and you lose a lot of your diversity. So there's a lot of issues, but I would say those are the kind of factors we do.
Okay, Mary, then we're going to put you on the spot now. Tell us about the upcoming native plant sale.
So there's an organization that encourages the use of native plants in home gardens. It's called Wild Ones. They're nationwide, but there is a group in this area out of Gibson Woods. And they do have a native plant sale every year. There's a lot of places to get native plants, but this is just one local organization. And the plant sale is held the first Saturday of May. So this year that's May 7th, I believe. And it's at Oak Ridge Prairie. That's a Saturday morning from about 9 a.m. to 1 o'clock. If you want to start putting some native plants in your home garden, you can stop by and pick up a few plants and see how it goes.
Wonderful. And Mary, remind me to put it on the calendar too. We'll put that out there. And then Gerard asked a question, is there any chance of another bio blitz like the one that happened in the Dunes National Park a few years back? Have we heard anything about that?
Okay, well, I have participated in some bio blitzes, but they seem to not be happening as much anymore. For whatever reason, I don't know, but they were common in the 90s and the aughts, but it seems like 2010 came around. I don't hear about many anymore. I may be just deaf and not catching it, but I think someday maybe they'll come back. And I think bio blitzes are great for public awareness. That's the greatest thing about them. The problem with from a biological point of view is they happen all in 1 or 2 days. And if it's raining all those days, you don't get many reptiles or anything. So you get a little bit skewed view of the wildlife in your area, but they're still valuable, and especially from a public point of view. But I don't hear about them so much anymore.
Well, I see Nathaniel figured out his raise hand emoji, so I will let him chime in as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was clapping and I was like, wait, I'm supposed to be raising my hand. It's not my first time on Zoom, I promise. No, I'll send you over. There's the Indiana Academy of Science has a BioBlitz every year. That's really, we had a great turnout in Southern Indiana last year. Just in the botany section, we had over 30 people. This year it's going to be at Bean Blossoms Nature Preserve down in Bloomington.
Nice,
and then
nice.
there's also a BioBlitz. I got to call Megan in Kokomo as well, the end of June. So there's a handful of bio blitzes that are potentially going on. I think Ken Click is putting one on out in somewhere around Chicago region. So I'll start forwarding you them over there, Spencer, and get you back in the
Okay,
loop.
thanks.
Yeah, can you send them to me also? I'll put it, like I said, I'll put them on the calendar.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely.
All right, so are there any more questions out there? Oh, we have Sue said that iNaturalist City Challenge is at the end of the month and it's like a photo bio blitz. So we'll look into that too. Yeah, if you don't have the iNaturalist app, that's something you should consider doing as well. So if there's no more questions, I want to thank everyone for participating. This was a wonderful way to kind of end off our academic year, but just really springboard us into the volunteer and stewardship season that's coming up. So I'm going to challenge everybody to pick a couple dates and places where they're going to go out and volunteer and see if we can blow that 1% out of the water that Spencer was shooting for. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Spencer, so much.
You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.